welcome back to another episode of the Apparatus Workshop. Obviously, Nick Wilbur joined with Win Slough. Today, we're going to talk about data, just how we're going to use it in the fire service and why it's kind of important for Apparatus. And we'll kind of jump right into the topic, and we're just going to kind of talk through why we get data, when we get data, how we use the data, and kind of what parts of the data are important for us. When we look at fleets, we look at replacing apparatus, and we evaluate just even an apparatus needs assessment. We're looking at a specific rig or the entire fleet together. And so data is a weird piece of information that with computers and new technology, we've kind of dove into this new thing with all these apps and places that we can get data, and sometimes it becomes overwhelming or we don't have it all in one spot. So I think the biggest piece of all of this is making sure we're capturing the right stuff and being able to evaluate it or pull it from whatever location it's in so that we can actually go through and kind of dive into it and dissect it. And depending on the department, this can be a yearly thing. This can be a quarterly thing. Sometimes it can be even a monthly thing that we're evaluating this. And so I think when we walk into a door, we've gone across the country asking for departments to provide us, certain pieces of data that we're going to cover here in a second. And we have some departments that knock it out of the park. They give us all these great figures, and we're able to write really good reports based on that data. Then other departments, we walk in and they hand us a box of receipts of all the apparatus in one kind of container, and we're missing a whole bunch of other stuff in the report, and it becomes very difficult. We can still kind of draw conclusions based on the information that we get, but it's a lot more difficult to kind of pinpoint what each apparatus is kind of costing and kind of what staffing levels look like, how many times that rig's leaving the firehouse, and some of those kind of key points there. So I'm going to slide it over to Win, and we're just going to kind of talk about what type of data, what's important, and kind of after that we'll cover why, and then we'll kind of break down some of those pieces of information and how we use it in our reports and our thinking.
Yeah. So again, like you talked about, a lot of people aren't keeping great records of that. I think more and more every trade show we go to, again at work we just went through trying to find a data management company. There are thousands of them out there. It's just trying to pick the one that works best for you. Or if you develop one yourself, it's fine. Like you said, one of the big things is we get handed a bunch of receipts and we have to try to figure that out. Another way to maybe clean that up is your service provider should be able to separate that stuff out for you. If you say, hey, give me, the work orders on this pumper for the last 5 years, they should be able to provide that for you. That's just another alternative for you to get this stuff if you don't happen to have it. But like Nick said, some data should be collected after every call. And mileage and hours, I think that's, some of the two biggest ones. Again, when I look at mileage and hours for the specification or, to kind of build out when we're doing a fleet evaluation, is that helps determine the maintenance time frame, the intervals that you have to do that maintenance, right? So that's one of the first things data wise, because that overall maintenance cost is going to count towards the overall cost of your fire truck. So if you can look at it and say, hey, every so many miles this thing has to have an oil change, or miles or months or time, this has to have an oil change. Well, then that I can start to build that out. All right, this oil change, this whole complete service is going to cost me, X number of dollars. Every 40,000 miles, I have to re-grease, my axles, my kingpins, all of that stuff. Well, that's on top of that oil change or that yearly service. So now I have to add that in and I can build it out. And, just because you don't run a whole lot of calls doesn't mean that your mileage isn't going to add up. Whether it's, mileage from driving to training or just your response area could be super large to where you might run 200 calls a year, but you might be traveling, 15, 20 miles to each call. Eventually that stuff's going to add up. So on that part of it, the mileage and hours are two of the biggest things. And, I'll let you jump in on the fleet, evaluation side where that can come into play too.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing too is you talk about miles and hours together, and why that's like a huge distinction that we're not separating the two out. A lot of people just look at mileage, and I think hours comes into there too because like somewhere like Arlington, right? For our engines or even our special services to an extent, but the mileage might be a little bit lower, but we're running, let's say, a mile and a half to a call, a mile and a half back. You look at that hour meter between our engines and our medic units when we're sitting on the scene of a call, we're going up to the 23rd floor, and back and down. Like those response criterion, the hour meter is still running on the fire truck, but our mileage is down. So we might run a fire truck and have maybe 3 or 4 times the hour meter running than we do at any other fire truck in the country or, a comparable size department with a bigger first due. So I think you have to kind of look at those hand in hand. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. And by no means am I an expert in the translation, but you can translate those hours into miles to an extent when it comes into service regiments, right? And so because the fire truck's sitting outside, you may not have to, grease the wheels or change the shocks out more often, right? Because the fire truck's just sitting there. But any of the motor, transmission, things like that, you might want to consider upping some of those, frequencies because the motor is running at idle. Again, looking at the, regen system or DEF system because it is maybe enacting more, need to be used more because you're not getting those highway miles. It's just all city miles. So you're going to be running, some more regens and things. Your DEF fluid and your fuel consumption might go up from just sitting there. So again, we can kind of use those hours to translate and kind of look at what our vehicle is going to do.
Right.
And I think that's a huge thing that we need to talk about together. And that's something that, we see low miles, low hours, high mileage, low hours, or high, low mileage, high hours, like all those things kind of start painting us a picture of the story without looking at anything else. You can go into a fire truck and look at those two numbers and start looking at maybe call volume, size of first due, size of just response area, maybe not just the first due. Do you run a box alarm system where you're calling, multiple companies from farther away, like in Prince George's County, Trek 812 at a College Park, some of their distances, they're running 18-mile responses at times. That's a way big difference from Arlington, where our farthest truck response is maybe 6 miles, or 7. That, there and back, even just on a nothing call, just for, food on the stove, that's a lot of difference in mileage there. So I think that's something you can tell by just looking at those numbers right off the bat. For sure.
Right. And the other thing, specification wise, or when we get into evaluating the fleet and what's next is when you look at the engine hours versus the aerial hours. Yeah. And how, we need this pump or pump hours versus aerial hours, I guess would be the best way, right? Oh, we need this pump on this fire truck. And you look and there's 2,000 hours on the aerial and the pump has 30 hours on it, which is barely we always say is barely enough to even do the pump test on it. So, again, that helps you evaluate that set of data right there, helps you evaluate the true need for the pump. Is it worth the $40, $50, $60,000 and the loss of space on your fire truck to have it? So again, that's another piece of data that you can add that in. And then when you bring, and this is obviously something we're going to talk about shortly, but when you bring the ISO data into it, does it really benefit you to put that pump on that truck? And, so again, that's another set of data where that mileage and hours comes into play.
Generator's another one, right? Generator hours, like, oh, hey, we need a generator because XYZ, and, use is relative, right? Like, so for Arlington, we're running, let's say 2,500 calls a year on a fire truck. If that hour meter is, below 30, that probably shows that we're not really using it much. And that's probably a consideration. You go out into, a more rural area where the call volume is lower, let's say they're only running 200 calls a year. And let's say it's, a 10-year-old fire truck, 30 hours could actually be quite a significant number of hours of use. So I think, that kind of leads into the next thing, the number of runs, right? The number of responses plays back into our mileage hours. And again, we were talking specifically engine hours, and you brought up a great point. That's hours across everything, right? Every piece of attached equipment on that fire truck, whether it's an aerial pump, generator, anything that we can get data from, we want to get that. And I think the pump and the aerial are good ones to kind of compare when you look at a Quint and having a pump or not. you got to also look at training and testing, like you kind of brought up, right? If you're have a 30-year-old engine and there's 65 hours of pump time on there, well, if it's an hour a year in pump testing and you're pump testing, that leaves an hour of training a year, left, and that's really it. So you look at the use on structural fires, you're just not doing it. It's not being used in that fashion, possibly. Or worse would be if you are using it on some fires, that means that you're not training on it or you're not testing it, right? So like those numbers don't add up. Yeah, something's missing. Those numbers don't add up. Whatever way you look at it, those are some bad numbers, right? And I don't, for everybody that we've talked to, I think emotion gets involved in there. And this data starts pulling that emotion out of the conversation, and we start looking at factual data. Well, we feel like 3 years ago, it was the most needed thing ever because the other engine was 3 minutes behind us and we made a difference on that fire. But since those 3 years, staffing has changed, things have changed, the first due has changed, access has changed, and we're not looking at that because that one call was very impactful on us, which matters, right? It should be part of the conversation, but it shouldn't drive the conversation. We should let the data of actually what is happening on the day-to-day help make our decisions a little bit better. So I think number of runs is a big one, and staffing. So if we run 2,000 calls a year and we start looking at staffing, it's not only number of runs of the department, but it's number of runs of each apparatus too. So, we have 2 engines in a truck and a rescue squad, and we have 2,000 runs a year, and 1,800 runs are going out of the engine, and the truck and the rescue make it out, let's say, 6 or 7 times a year. That's a problem, right? Now we're going to be going and spending in excess of $2 million in a truck, in excess of $1.5, $1.8 million, depending on where you're going, for a rescue squad. Maybe you got to look at combining some of those vehicles now into a rescue engine, a rescue truck, whatever it looks like, because those responses just aren't there. And we look at the staffing, and we have a 40 or 50 member department, or maybe we're only staffing one rig with 4, the other one we're cross staffing with 2 or 3 from an EMS unit, or 2 or 3 people are only what's available. Now we have to start looking, well, we have more rigs than we do people, or seats for people to ride. Those rigs are just not going to get out. So we're going and spending this money. Maybe that's not the way we need to go. Let's do a needs assessment. What do we actually need out of a ladder truck or a rescue squad or an engine? And where can we maybe find a place to combine those units together?
Right. And then, conversely on the staffing, as I used to work for a small department where there was maybe 2 of us. When we went to lunch, we took the pickup truck. Now, they're running 4 full-time people every day. When they go to lunch now they're running the fire truck out the door. So now your mileage and again, your hours are going to increase versus what it used to be a couple years ago. So, again, that data, that change in data, you need to follow that so that you can make adjustments. Your replacement schedule might speed up because of that. Your fuel costs are going to increase because of that. Everything budget-wise is going to increase because of just that small change of taking, the pickup truck versus taking, the fire engine. Just to get lunch or, to go anywhere. And, you need to go pick up something to do a small repair or at the firehouse. You're going to take the fire truck now. So that staffing, both the available staffing might affect your replacement plan based on, hey, we don't need this anymore because we can't staff 5 engines or whatever. But also it might increase it because, now we're putting more miles on this fire truck. And at some point that return on investment is going to decrease the time frame that you can keep that fire truck. So
I think to go on that point too, staffing as far as available numbers, in Arlington, we have the easiest job in the world because our staffing's 4 every day, all day, right? We don't really drop down to 3, and very rarely, especially now. I mean, everybody's kind of facing this with the staffing kind of where it's at now. We're not really going to 5, right? We don't really have extra people lying around. It's not really a thing we run into. And with so many trainees for our medics and things like that, they would most likely go to the medic unit first anyway, not necessarily a fire truck. So when we spec'd out the tower ladder at work, that was a huge part of our decision, right? We placed 6 seats in a fire truck for a resale value and some other things. And, in case we do run that extra person or just have that availability, shift change or something like that, we can have some extra people hop on if that's the case. But we don't do that on a day-to-day. We have maybe a 2 or 3% chance of having that 5th person. Well, that was a good kind of thought process and piece of data for us to have from going to a 60 inch to a 70 inch cab to a 60 inch cab. We took 10 inches off the wheelbase based on our staffing levels, knowing that we didn't need that 10 extra inches of room in the cab for that fifth or sixth firefighter, right? And we got some funny pictures when they went out to do final inspection of some of the bigger members of our department sitting across from each other, kind of locking those legs in, right? But that's a huge consideration, right? That's a difference between, there and where I volunteered at College Park and our staffing levels where we were running 6, 7, and 8 people on a fire truck. That 70-inch cab is huge, right? We need that space to be able to fit everybody in there and safely be seatbelted in. And that goes back to some studies where 4 seats across the fire truck is just not really a safe thing anymore. We understand that now with the needed space for a firefighter to sit down, be buckled, and actually be able to maneuver and fit in a fire truck. That's been proven now in studies that 4 people across the back is not enough space. So we look at maybe 7 being the most we can fit, unless we're a tiller truck, that 8th person might come in. Are we actually going to have that many people? And we go to plenty of places for fleets. You open up the cab and it's this 10-person cab where there's 8, 10, 9, 7 seats in there. And you start looking at the records and you're like, where are there 7 or 8 or 10 people? You have 30 active members now, and less than 10 are showing up to 60 or more % of the calls. And there's 3 or 4 other rigs here in the firehouse. If you even do get 7 on this, then those rigs, you don't even need a staff. And so we can start taking those specs and bringing them a little bit closer in and tighter. Now they're easier to drive. More drivers are going to be wanting to drive it because it's a more maneuverable fire truck. We can change all of that thought process by just that one piece of data. So it's so important.
Right. Not only you talked about wheelbase, but not only we increased our operational capabilities by increasing our scrub angle without that extra 10 inches on the cab, right?
Yeah.
Now
absolutely.
we can swing that aerial around even farther for, to the front of the cab. So, again, having that data of staffing, again, it's just one more thing that ties into down the road on where we're going to go with that, right?
Wait, right? We ran into that not too long ago where we had, more than enough seats in a fire truck. I believe it was 8 in that unit where they're overweight on the front axle. And that was an easy one. They took 2 seats out and now they're kind of back within the weight again because they just didn't have it. We look at the staffing numbers and you're not riding 8. So we can drop that down. And at the specing thing, when we go to look at the fire truck from the beginning, that could be the difference between, a 20,000 or a 22.5 axle, right? Or 21.5 or whatever. That could be the difference between axles, which saves us a couple more dollars now too. Again, we need to look at not what we feel that we need 8 seats, because back in the day when the heyday, we had 50, 60 people in our department. We have these numbers now that show that that's not what's our reality anymore, right? And that can kind of change things. And I think career versus volunteer, and I say that in that I think most listeners will get that distinction. But at College Park, it's funny because we staff the firehouse like a career firehouse, even though we're volunteers. So duty crews or things like that can change this thought process, or cross staffing in the career side can change this thought process. But, for me at Arlington, I ride X rig every day, right? So I go on the rescue squad. That's my spot. The room and space for me is nice in there, right? I'm living out of that fire truck for the day. So my gear in there, technical rescue gear in there. I got sweatshirts, water bottle, things like that, right? That, phone charger could be important. We kind of talked about that. Some of these niceties, right? Again, not something that's needed, but a nicety to make that person comfortable in the 24-hour shift they have to spend or longer on that fire truck. Where if you go to the volunteer side, they're coming in, they're running a call and they're coming home. So that could change things too. I think the way it's staffed, the number of people, all that stuff plays a part in that fire truck spec.
Right. And then, also with that, we used to talk about keeping all that stuff on a fire truck. You also have to talk about having some carts in the firehouse and making sure you have budget for that so that you can put all your stuff on it and move it out of there.
Yeah, that's true. No. That's very true.
Too much stuff to just carry and quickly relieve somebody.
Oh my God! Yeah, the number of times I almost throw my back out relieving people because they just carry too much. Yeah, on a toolbox, they carry a toolbox worth of stuff. Yeah.
So let's talk about how this data can help, I guess, and how I guess some extra data on top of it can help you determine the maintenance cost and how maintenance cost, the acquisition, and out of service time all kind of play into, it's somewhere, whether it be 12, 13 years, the return on investment starts to change. And you have to start looking at, hey, how much is this fire truck costing me today? How much is it going to cost me every year that I wait to replace it? And then on top of that, because it's getting so old, how much is the out of service time costing me, on top of that? Because again, at some point you have to start to group all that together. Hey, this is what this fire truck's costing me. This is what a new fire truck is going to cost me now. And then because every year that I wait, I need to add that change in cost. So it might cost me $50,000 to maintain this fire truck. Every year that I wait right now, depending on what you're buying, is somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000 of price increase. So I have to add that to that maintenance cost, kind of as we think about that, because that price is just going to continue to go up. And then again, that out of service time, you have to have a cost on what your out of service time is kind of costing you too, because if that pumper is out of service for so long, that has to be added into that too. And it kind of should help, hopefully that data would help, with a budget and with a replacement plan.
Yeah, I think, the first part of our conversation here, we talked a lot about, what we would do with a new apparatus and maybe kind of, what some ballpark figures would be on use. And we kind of dove a little deeper into when we buy a new one, the data, how it's important to shape that new rig. The maintenance costs, acquisition costs, out of service time, and even budget, like all that stuff play into when that fire truck needs to leave the fleet. And I think, evaluating those, when I talked about evaluating some of this data on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis, like that's something that needs to be evaluated quarterly or yearly, right? And it could even be monthly, depending on the number of runs you run. And this goes back to staffing, kind of gets thrown in that there too. If you're looking at staffing and you say that, you had X number of members, 60, 70 members, we're dropping down to 30. We need to start looking at our fleet and thinning that fleet out because we just don't have the people to staff the apparatus. We look at maintenance and acquisition costs. Those kind of go hand in hand to an extent because, like you said, the maintenance costs, as they go up, resale value goes down, and the cost to acquire a new fire truck goes up. There's a line there where we can kind of thin that out. And, I'll let you explain Arlington's replacement plan process here in a second, because I think that's a huge example of how to do it right. Like how that is probably one of the best ones in the country that I've heard of or I've seen. And that was, I heard about it before I joined there. And I was kind of astounded and kind of how all that works and just how in tune some of that data is, that nobody has an argument. Everyone's on the same page, from fire department to accounting to county manager. Everybody's in the same page here because it just makes so much sense because we have the data to support it. But I think you just take a look outside of Arlington in our area. You don't have to look very far, and if you look across the country, there's just even more where the out of service time is crushing people. They don't have enough fire trucks in the reserve fleet to cover the out of service time on fire trucks. Parts are being delayed. Older rigs now, you can't find parts. You think about it as a fire truck manufacturer. I mean, this new engine coming in is going to be a huge, another paradigm shift where I don't need to buy or build parts now for this 5-10 year motor. I'm barely keeping up with the new motor that we're making now to make this new EPA existing motor fit in a fire truck and be ready to go. I'm going to focus my effort there. That's the new sale. That's where my money's coming from. The parts for this old motor, I don't really care about anymore. And so where we used to keep parts for, 10 or 15 or 20 years, that's starting to slowly go away. And it's becoming harder and harder to find parts. And then you go to, a College Park had the American LaFrance that's out of business. There's nowhere to even find those parts anymore. So now you're trying to find substitute or engineered parts. It's going to take more time, more money, and it's just going to crush your budget. If you can explain Arlington's process a little bit and how we kind of leverage some of those numbers and what we do with it, I think that would be a huge starting point for this conversation of what the way to do it right, I guess, the right way.
Well, again, you use those numbers and again, I think at 13 years, give or take somewhere in there is where you really start to lose money on a fire truck. So every year we can take that replacement schedule down and closer, then our return on investment is going to increase. So right now in Arlington, we're at an 8-year replacement plan. So at 8 years, we're getting a pretty large amount of money back from our resale vendor, essentially. So when we sign a contract to buy a fire truck, we also sign a contract the same day to sell it 8 years down the road. And we're given a guaranteed price. And, as long as that fire truck falls into the parameters still in 8 years, we have to make repairs to it, things like that. It has to be in good condition. Then we get, our guaranteed price or our guaranteed buyback money back. So that money goes right back into the purchase of a new fire truck. So, instead of paying, $1.2 million for a pumper today, we might just have $800,000 on the book. So again, that helps that offset, that repurchase of that fire truck. But again, having the right data, and maybe the right data based on mileage and hours is closer to 10 years for your fire company or 12 years. You might still be able to get the same return on investment based on mileage and hours. The thing that kind of hurts in that case would be the technology that goes into these things at this point. But again, that return on investment could still be there. But you have to have that data as to why that is available. What are my miles? What are my hours? What's left of this fire truck? Again, the maintenance records, do we keep good track of it? Are we maintaining it properly? Are we following the manufacturer's recommendations? All that stuff kind of plays in. And if you have that documentation, then it's just going to it's going to, increase that return on your investment to where it helps offset these super high costs of the fire trucks.
I think the big thing with maintenance there too is transmissions and motors, right? Some of the most expensive things, axles, suspension. If you look at Arlington rigs, with the exception of within the last month, which is kind of ironic because we have a tower ladder, like we were talking about, we're in the midst of replacing, and within a month of the new tower ladder coming in, our current tower ladder, blew the transmission. Well, that's something that's a foreign replacement to us, right? We're really not replacing transmissions, motors, suspension. Those are all things that you're seeing on 10, 12, 15, 20-year fire trucks. That's where the issues come in, right? We just don't see that. And those are some big ticket item fixes. You take those out of the conversation, that brings that maintenance cost way down. Now the money we're spending on the new fire truck is going back into a new fire truck. And I think, you heard this comment. Why would we get rid of a fire truck now and spend $1.2 million when this one's costing us nothing? Well, a maintenance cost is costing you a lot of money, and it's almost the equivalent of what a new fire truck payment would cost if you're going to, take out a loan on it. And furthermore than that, eventually you have to get rid of it. And the fire trucks are only getting more expensive. There's not going to be a point where you're just going to get this great deal, right? And if you use it to where it's no longer existent, like we had a fleet we did where they just never got rid of fire trucks out of their fleet because there was no resale value. Right. You're not going to get a whole lot in the resale value. You get, maybe $5,000-$6,000 because you've used it till it's done. The problem is now you're not taking that $15,000, $20,000 a year maintenance cost out of your fleet and your budget. So although you didn't make money, you're still spending money on something where you convert that to a special ops unit. You convert that to the third reserve for whatever reason. Well, now you're still doing oil changes. You're still doing preventive maintenance. And when you do use it, it's just going to break that much easier now because nothing's being greased like it should or work like it should, or the motor's not running like it should. So all that stuff kind of plays into that. There is a breaking point for everybody's fleet. And in Arlington, we found at 8 years where money spent is going to be more than money gained back. And that goes to the price of rigs and everything else. And I think that's a big thing that without that data, we couldn't sit down and have those conversations. And we would be just like every other major fire company fleet in the news right now. Nobody out there is immune to all of the issues going on between acquisition time to get a fire truck in service, just money available to buy fire trucks. And even if you had an unlimited budget right now and a messed up fleet, you look at some of the major cities out there, you could give them an influx of $15, $20 million right now, which is a large sum of money, and it wouldn't even touch the issues they have in their fleet. There's not enough reserves available or used fire trucks to fix it. The fire trucks can't be built fast enough to fix it. And for 4 years or 3 years that it takes to build a fire truck now, the amount of money they're spending just to keep fire trucks in service is a lot. And the out of service time they're getting is insurmountable. So you just can't, you could buy 60 fire trucks today and it couldn't fix your fleet for years.
Right. And that, again, it goes back to that data. If you have that data of what that stuff's costing you, then you can budget that and plan for that in your fleet replacement schedule. Like you can say, all right, well, we're going to, at 15 years, this fire truck's going to go into reserve status, but we are also at 15 years going to sign a contract on a new one. So, again, instead of, I'm still going to have to pay the maintenance costs, but that's $50,000 a year or whatever that happens to be. But if I wait past that 15 years, then again, we have to start adding in the average price increases to start doing it. And that's going to mess your budget up. And we've seen that with some of the evaluations that we've done where they pushed the recommendation, to replace this fire truck in, 2018, and now it's 2024, and we're just buying that fire truck. And now instead of them being able to replace on a certain schedule, now we're looking at refurbing fire trucks because the money's not there to buy a new one anymore. So again, now that's just going to affect, because you can refurb it, but again, your return on investment is way, way down. And even a refurb, you're most likely not putting a new motor in it. So you're still going to have, the headaches or the issues that can come up with a 20-year-old transmission or a 20-year-old motor. So again, utilizing that data that you get to build out that fleet replacement schedule and then ensuring that you stay on it becomes really, really important. And again, if you have that data, then you have that strength to go back against your borough, your, whoever, your county commissioners or whoever or is running your money to make sure that you have that money available to buy that fire truck. And you can explain why it's important to stay on the schedule, and make them be able to see the effect of any delay that you're going to have into it.
Yeah, I think the big thing, you talk about rehabbing, refurb in a negative light, and there is 100% a negative side to that. But with this data, we can do things like, if you look at an ambulance and you say, all right, our big ticket maintenance items are transmission, motor, suspension. Well, that involves nothing of the box of the ambulance, right? Well, if I re-chassis for a third of the price at the 10-year mark or 6-year mark, whatever that year mark is, I've now put a new motor, transmission, and chassis and suspension in there. Well, guess what? That's going to change out all my big ticket items. The box isn't what's costing me money in maintenance. Now I fixed my problem without spending the money for a new ambulance. And at $400,000 or so for a new ambulance, you could offset and maybe spend $200, $250 on a remount. Well, now I get a newer ambulance quicker. But if I wait 20 years or 30 years to replace that ambulance, that box might be so beat up because the suspension and everything else is dogged out, and the cushions and everything are torn up. That might not be a good replacement plan anymore. Same thing like a tanker, right? The tank, the pump, all that stuff could be good. And it's just the suspension and the motor that could be an issue. All right, re-chassis that. Rehabbing, refurbing ladder trucks, right? But if you're in a small department running 30, 40 calls a year, NFPA recommends that 20 to 25 year lifespan of a fire truck in the annex, right? So it's a recommendation, and it's even a recommendation of a recommendation, right? It's not a requirement. And, 15 to 20 years frontline service, 3 to 5 reserve. They throw all these numbers out there, but you can't use that as a blanket statement, right? And somebody can throw that in your face, or you can try throwing that in somebody else's face. But at the end of the day, you have a ladder truck running 20 calls a year at $2 million. At 15 years, you rehab it, you can go 30 years with that fire truck pretty easily, right? If you buy a sound fire truck with good components on it, and you're not going up and above and beyond and getting all this, crazy stuff on there that's going to cost you a lot in maintenance, that fire truck can last quite a long time. And I think that goes back to the maintenance cost part of it too. What you spec on the fire truck, you can see if it's working or not. Big things that we've seen, and this is not a knock on any particular manufacturer or anything, but electronic valves compared to regular valves. Like there's more maintenance costs in that. Anything that's air operated, right? What are you going to have to do to replace that? And what are the parts availability? We've seen air operated steps, air operated, masts for lights or, cameras or anything like that, and some command units. Well, if that stuff breaks, that can get very expensive over time to fix. Is there a better way to do that? Right. Electronic valve, and I'm a huge fan of like a front intake on an engine or something like that. You start putting them into the individual discharges, you would have a better idea of pricing than I would, but 4,000 maybe, a piece compared to maybe a couple $100 for a normal pull valve. So now we go into what that does to affect acquisition costs, which is again, another piece of data we want to keep track of. And then what that looks like over our maintenance costs at the time. So we can spend $40, $50, $60,000 on electronic valves or something like that in places that maybe we didn't need them. And now we look 10, 15 years down the road, we're spending $5,000, $6,000 a year just to fix or maintain or replace those valves to keep them serviceable. Goes back to out of service time. Now the rig's out of service, getting that component fixed. And again, that's just one general example, not saying that they're bad, anything like that, but that's the data that we need to do a deep dive into that. We have a budget for a fire truck. We're going to go now higher in our budget because we're doing things that are more expensive. The yearly budget to maintain that's going to be more expensive. And then again, we're not going to get that resale at the end of the day because a fire truck that's 15 years old with whatever mileage is worth what it's worth. Foam systems are a big one we see too, right? Huge foam systems with foam tanks adds weight, adds money. The use maintenance of that is costing money. And we see how many calls are you using foam on? Well, maybe 2 a year. All right, well, maybe a pickup tube is the better option, right? And we saw that in Arlington. So I think all of that stuff plays into that data, how we use it. Reserves, another one, right? I mean, if you want to talk about that, how many reserves do we need? I mean, that's a whole different podcast, but how can we use the data for reserves, right? I mean, that's a huge thing like that we can kind of use to leverage that.
Right, and I think you talked, going back kind of to the remount thing is we're talking about data on the back end, but there's plenty of data on the front end that we can have. Most of it will be from the manufacturers, but if we're looking at, all right, well, I'm going to buy a pumper, and every manufacturer has the ability to build a stainless steel body. Maybe I want to spend that money up front because if I know that this most likely is going to work for me, this pumper body is going to work for me for a very long time. Well, if I have a pumper body that's built that isn't going to rust out on me, then I might be able to cut that in 15 years, 12 years. I might be able to cut the cost of my next replacement down in half, provided I have, and it all ties together, but provided I have the right amount of reserve units that I can have that out of service time. But if I can, all I have to do is buy a new chassis, and I can move that pumper body over, then that saves me, we're talking half the cost of a replacement of a fire truck. And so if we plan that out and say, hey, we're going to spend more money up front on a stainless body, but we plan on pulling it off, or, utilizing, maybe we have to replace the pump, but, that's not that big a deal. Or maybe the pump's still in good enough shape because we did the right things when we built it. We built it out of stainless steel piping. We painted it. We maintained it. That pump might be good enough to move along too. And now again, we've just cut the cost of a fire truck in half, and we re-chassis it. I think data too from the manufacturers, whether you're looking at, what type of front axle are we going to put on it? Are we going to put on a traditional leaf spring? Would a parabolic spring, be better? Is there less maintenance costs in a parabolic spring? Again, this is all data you have to get from the manufacturer, but the parabolic spring has paint all the way around it, whereas the leaf spring doesn't. It's gonna rust quicker than a parabolic leaf spring. Does an independent front suspension, does the offset cost of maybe potentially less maintenance on that, offset the cost of the actual, the $20,000 difference? I don't know, but you have to look at that data from the manufacturers, read all about it, study it, and make sure that, again, we might spend more money up front, but when you look at it all together, it might be a better investment on us to spend that money now and not spend it down the road.
And I think another thing with that was we go back to weight, and I'm going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it probably every podcast, but the independent front suspension in some aspects, they're talking about, volunteer career, or I would just say the use of the fire truck every day. We're riding in it all the time versus not. We're spending independent front suspension, that money, because people like the ride quality better. When you have 2 or 3 miles of first due and you're running 200 calls a year, that might not be the money you want to spend, right? Comparatively, if you have people riding it every day, all day, running a couple thousand calls a year, that might actually, that might prevent some people from, back injuries or just being uncomfortable, right? Like just quality of firefighting life, like that might be money you want to spend in then, right? I get that. There's a weight thing too. Like we don't just need to keep increasing axles or do this stuff that's expensive if we're not taking in consideration the weight. I think there's a lot of people out there that put independent front suspensions on because they have poor ride quality, but it might have nothing to do with the suspension. It's just the weight. You might be overloading, underloading, not equally loading the fire truck. And so we've had that conversation with a couple people where it's like, well, what's the weight? Well, I don't know. Then don't make the decision yet, right? Because you don't have the right information. And that goes back to just other data to make that decision, right? We want to make informed decisions, not, misinformed decisions.
And, again, data wise there is, kind of, not to throw College Park under the bus, but you guys put the wrong axles on a fire truck, right?
Yeah,
you didn't match the axles. So now this thing is bouncing up and down in different directions and your ride quality is horrible. And, weight as well with axles is, an independent front suspension is heavy. I mean, it's just a heavy axle in itself. So that's going to add to the overall weight of that fire truck instead of dropping down to a leaf spring or parabolic. You can take some weight off of your fire truck there, and you might be able to even find a similar quality ride if everything is in balance. The weight of your fire truck's proper. The rear suspension matches the front suspension. These are all, kind of important things that you can, fix with the data that you have up front. Again, and taking this to your manufacturer or calling the axle vendor and saying, hey, this is what we want to do. What would you recommend for this? And utilizing that data to make good decisions when you're purchasing the fire truck, which, again, when you make the right decisions on your axle, it's going to prolong the life of the rest of the fire truck because everything's going to ride together nice and smooth. And you're not going to have the jarring of the body where you might have body cracks. You're not going to, the electronics aren't going to get jarred around to where they get messed up, things like that. So, again, utilizing all sorts of data and collecting all sorts of data becomes really, really important in this fire truck build and evaluation of your fleet.
I think one last thing on that too, like to show how weight matters to an extent, axles and things, we can look at repair tickets and maintenance costs. And it's again, the total cost of an apparatus, but it's also what those ticket items are. And we see brakes going through like crazy. We see alignments needed. We see going through tires, springs, shocks, suspension, all those things. We look at that in the office before we go out and even look at the fire trucks. And you're like, that fire truck's overweight right there.
Right.
No, right off the bat, right? That fire truck's overweight, 95% chance or a 5% chance that something was done wrong at the factory. So at some point, us as the customer or consumer, we missed something, whether we missed on final inspection that the build plate and what is actually on the fire truck don't match, or we went through and we overloaded the fire truck more than what the manufacturer NFPA allotted for us for equipment. And now this fire truck's not riding like it was designed and built for. And it's illegal, right? It's against the law, and it's, there's no exemption for that, especially in the court of law, and you're liable for it. As the driver, as the department, as the municipality, everybody down the line is going to get in trouble for something like that. And so that looking at that data, even though you're not doing what's required weighing the fire truck, that data can start painting a picture that we messed something up on this fire truck. We need to either get it fixed now, or the next time we spec a fire truck, we need to go back and kind of clean that up. And I think at the end of the day, like big pieces of data, and we'll talk about kind of what data we've talked about throughout here so that the listeners can write a list down and kind of start gathering it. But also, at the end of the day, what we're looking for is a cost of ownership for a fire truck. So all the data combined together, how much does that fire truck cost for you to run a year? And that's something that fuel mileage and, how much fuel. I don't think that really plays into a factor here, because it's not like you're going to go buy, a hybrid fire truck tomorrow because fuel costs are too high. I don't think that is part of the decision making process yet. Maybe that can be down the road. We're looking more at how much this vehicle costs to run and maintain a year. That is a very important number. If nothing else, that is a number that you need to have and be able to look at least yearly, more likely quarterly or monthly, depending on your call volume. And into that, you can tie that to mileage. How much is this costing per mile or per run for you to run or operate? That is another important figure. And again, that's going to depend on how many calls you have, things like that, the size of your first due. But we were able to do that in a municipality that had very good records. And we could see that two engines from two different departments that ran together had similar call volumes. And it was like $2.80 per mile to run and operate this fire truck. And it was like $42.16 for this fire truck. That is a problem. You don't need to be an apparatus expert or a fleet manager to understand that something is going wrong. We need to figure that out. So this year, something happened that fire truck was way too expensive to own and operate. And again, you can just look at trends like this is, $2 a year, $2.50 a year, $3 a year, $17 a year. We need to probably get this fire truck out of the fleet, or something went wrong that we need to fix today so that we're back to that $3 a year again, or $3.50, and have that steadily increasing over time instead of just these huge costs that come over us. If you're not looking at that on a yearly basis, you're going to be sitting there drowning in your budget and now have no money for a fleet replacement plan, or any fleet or any sort of apparatus replacement. And you're just going to be sitting there for the next 10 years just drowning. And that's what we're trying to prevent here.
Yeah. So what you talked about it, what data, I guess, is important to capture daily, monthly? I mean, what should people be, what's the list that people should have? Hey, this is what I need to capture. And this is what's going to allow me to evaluate those numbers like you just talked about, per run, per year, however you want to break it down. But these are the things that I need to capture on a routine basis to allow this, data to help me.
I think when we walk in to do a fleet evaluation, these are the big pieces of data that we look for to evaluate the fleet. And I think it's huge. So mileage being tracked throughout the year, and you can do it on a yearly basis. You can do it on a monthly basis. If there's some sort of apparatus checks on a weekly, monthly basis, grab the mileage and hours. And it could be the hours of everything, right? I think use of the vehicle. So it's not just how many runs this department runs. So like, we run 200 calls a year. No, I want to know you ran 200 calls a year. This is how many fires, EMS calls, whatever. What's my dispatch procedure on those calls, right? So am I sending the ladder truck on an EMS call? That's going to be something I want to know, because that's wear and tear on a vehicle, and maybe something that we can maybe send the engine or a brush truck or something else on that call to maybe save those larger vehicles. I want to know what that vehicle is supposed to be responding to, how many times it got out, right? So just because it's supposed to go in a structure fire doesn't mean we had the staffing or ability to get that vehicle out. So how many times that vehicle went out for those call types, and then what the staffing was for that vehicle when it went out. A ladder truck with 8 seats going out with one person is not an acceptable level of staffing and doesn't necessitate $2.2 million to buy a new one, right? That's something that we really need to look at. Again, is it combining vehicles? Is it changing it to a quint? Whatever. Like, we got to look at that very hardcore, because that's a lot of money for not. Maybe we take that money and put it into more staffing, whether it's paying them per call, the volunteers, or paying career personnel. Maintenance costs, every single piece of maintenance, and have it itemized out, right? And not per month necessarily. Maybe you look at it every month to make sure we're kind of maintaining it and evaluating that at least on a quarterly or yearly basis. And any big ticket items we're going to highlight, right? If it's we're doing rehab or upgrading lights from regular strobe to LED, a motor had to get replaced or something. That's something that we can highlight and maybe separate out of that yearly cost, and maybe just see, okay, we had to replace the motor on a 15-year-old fire truck with however many miles. Maybe that was expected. So those numbers are going to be off, and that's why, right? So just because the number seems high doesn't mean it's out of whack. Like, it could be just because we had a major cost. So we can kind of separate that out and look at that. And then out of service time. I think that's probably the biggest thing that nobody tracks well is how often that fire truck, not that service, that fire truck. So in Arlington, engine 102 and station 2 is probably never out of service because we always have a reserve to take its place, right? That's not what we're tracking. We're tracking the frontline engine 102 with its ID number, how many times that goes out of service and for how long. Because as those times increase, that goes back into our reserves. How many reserves do we need to make sure that our fire trucks are covered? Again, major news in the last month or so, many departments are running out of reserves and just units are not being staffed. So that is a huge number to track to make sure that we're on point there. And again, that's just how we're using the rig and how that's changing, and then available staffing for our department. I think all those things together, you're going to be in a really good spot. And it doesn't have to be all in the same program necessarily, but it needs to be all recorded and be able to be looked at in a usable fashion, not just a bunch of numbers everywhere, and then compared from whenever you're evaluating to whenever you're evaluating. And that's going to help guide your decision-making process. If you don't do that now, that's something you need to do today. If you've never had your fleet evaluated, whether internally or externally, that's something you should be doing today. If you don't have a vehicle replacement plan, you need to do that today, right? The time to evaluate this data, to get this data together and to map out your fleet is not later. Where if you haven't done this, you're already 4 years behind the ball, because if you need a new apparatus, you're 4 years behind, right? So it's all that stuff kind of plays into this. It's very, very, very important. Again, reach out with any questions.
Yeah, and you talk about, it doesn't have to be hard. I know here in my volunteer house, we track and this is something I think people don't think about sometimes. All right, well, I don't need to track the fire prevention call I went on, or we went to pick up lunch. We don't need to track that. But, you really do. You want to track everything that fire truck's used for. And one of the easiest things that we do here is there's just a Google QR code printed up on top right by the emergency lights. And when every time that thing goes out, maybe not when you're pulling it to a parking lot to clean it, but if you go on a fire prevention run, or you go to training, or you go, to get lunch, or go to the other firehouse, when you get back, you snap a picture of that. It opens up a Google Doc. And again, it can be anything, any one of those software programs should have that capability to print a QR code and put it in Microsoft Teams, whatever, and capture that data for you. But you have to put in, the mileage, the hours, where you went, how much fuel you put in it. And that's, again, that just goes into a form that now you can go track. And all right, well, this is where this went. This is why it went out. This was who was driving it. So, it allows us to keep track of that. Really, really simple. And then again, same thing. If you come back and you find an issue that didn't get reported, now we can go back and say, all right, well, this was the last time I was out. It's not foolproof because, again, it relies on people to do the right thing, but it is better than not tracking anything at all. And it does track every use of that fire truck the way you'd want it to. So, but, I think, we've been going here long enough. I think we covered a lot of data points. Like you said, if you haven't had this stuff done, now's the time to do it, whether it's internally, whether using somebody else. Get a good look at your fire trucks, get a good look at your data, see where you're lacking, and then figure out how to close those gaps in so that you can make the right decisions, down the road on your replacement schedule, and make sure that you're not bleeding money out for no reason.
I think that's the biggest point we can drive home is every time we go do a fleet evaluation, somebody somewhere in the line, whether it's the fire department, the municipality, board of commissioners, whatever, just the normal everyday line firefighters, are shocked by the data that we're able to put together in a usable format. Whether it's what they are getting together, what they are missing in their data, what we find in our just inspection of the rig, it's like they didn't know it existed. Even being a member for 10, 15, 20, 35, 50 years, they didn't know that this was happening. Whether it's the first due, right? We've talked about needs assessment in the first due. People have been shocked seeing, taller buildings than they were expecting with the need for more, ladders or whatever. Every time we go out the door, somebody somewhere is shocked at what we have. And so I think this data helps close that gap. There's no more surprises now. We're doing the assessments that we should be doing. And if we don't know how to do it, we're bringing somebody else in. I think that's the biggest thing. And I think the more information that you can put together in a usable format, the easier everything else becomes. You're not thinking about it. You're not in crisis mode. We talked about crisis budgeting. We're out of that now. We're planning ahead so that we know. It's so much easier when you go to a politician and say, hey, listen, in 7 years, I need to order a fire truck. And in 3 or 4 years from then, it's going to come in and this is the price tag we're expecting. They have time now, right? Where they need to raise the budget by a cent right now. And that's going to help by the time the fire truck comes in and pay for it. It's not our fire truck's out of service. We need $2.2 million tomorrow. That's a way different conversation. And that's what this data
is. And with the right data, you can do the math. You can budget that out. You know the average cost increase. You can do that out, whether it's a quarterly cost increase, which is more math, or it's a yearly cost increase. But you can take those budget numbers and build it out and say, all right, well, in 15 years, when I have to replace this truck, this is what it's anticipating. This is what we anticipate spending on it. And now, again, what we have to do to get that money, whether, like you said, increase the budget. Unfortunately, for some people, it's having another chicken barbecue. Yeah. But you can build that out and say, this is what we need. But again, you have to have that right data. So
awesome. Yeah, I think that's a lot of information. I think we're definitely going to come back to that again. We didn't really talk about any programs that are available out there. And that's probably for another day. We'll definitely dive back into that and kind of maybe give people some more insight on some programs they can leverage to grab this data. But all the listeners out there, again, take that for what it's worth: mileage, hours, number of runs, staffing, maintenance costs, the acquisition cost, the cost to get the fire truck, out of service time, and keep track of that budget, right? Budget all those numbers so that all that data we're getting makes sense. If we're in the red, there's an issue. We want to see it today, not after the fact when we can't keep a fire truck in service or we don't have the money to replace it. Any questions, any information you need on any of this stuff, please reach out. Nick Wilbur at evr.solutions. Send us an email and we can get your question answered. And if you have any ideas for any topics in the future, please, again, send an email. We'll definitely go over and cover it. And check out all of our past podcasts and future podcasts on fire apparatus and emergency equipment. And there's a ton of other good information on fleets, spec and fire trucks, and equipment that you can find on those podcasts. Thanks for listening in, and be safe out there.
Hey, Nick. Yeah. Hey, one shameless plug. FDIC registration has opened up, and our friend Nick here is presenting there. So if you want to listen more to what he has to say, especially about ladder trucks, that's a good opportunity to get in there. So again, FDIC registration just opened up. Nick will be talking. So it's a good opportunity to get out and see him, shake his hand, and introduce yourselves and answer questions there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll all be floating around there. Everyone from Fire Apparatus Emergency Equipment, EVR, our company will all be out there. So definitely grab us, reach out ahead of time. We'll get some time. We can answer some questions and chat fire trucks. That's why we're here, right? We love talking fire trucks. So on that note, thank you. Appreciate it. Register for FDIC, come out to a good show, and be safe out there.
Thank you all.